Welcome to Bad Shit, a frank and funny look at living with mental illness.
While we'll touch on several illnesses, Batshit is focused on those along the spectrum of bipolar disorders. I'm your host, Adam.
And I'm your other host, Brad.
And we're both bipolar, so strap in and let's see how batshit we really are.
Spoiler alert, pretty damn bad shit. This episode's topic, masculinity, part 2.
Part 2.
But this time we have a very special guest.
We have an awesome guest. Her name is Ayden Cox. Hi, Ayden.
Hi, guys.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Good to be here. Good to be here all the way from Belfast in Ireland.
There you go. So, guys, we're now...
we're international.
International. We're a pretty big deal.
That feels like cheating because I am from California.
That's no. And
No, it works.
Let us take what we can get here, please.
You know, we're like number 25 on the mental health charts in Jordan and the Sudan.
Really? The Sudan? Huh.
Yeah.
Maybe Brad's part Sudanese. I don't know. So what's awesome about Ayden is she's a cultural anthropologist and a brewer. So I know cultural anthropologist is probably more applicative to what we do.
With a background in gender studies.
Right, but the brewing is kind of awesome.
Yeah.
Just on top of that. So can you tell me just for... Did you get into brewing first and then later decide, you know what, I guess I'll do cultural anthropology on top of that? Or was you like, oh my God, I've done so much study into cultural anthropology, I need to drink more, thus the brewing slipped in after?
So I actually was into gender issues, anthropology, and that kind of stuff before I professionally started brewing. I did home brewing back in California when I was at community college. It's a very expensive hobby, so I never had my own setup or anything. But I went to undergrad in Lowell, Massachusetts, which used to be the carjacking capital of the U.S. at some point.
Oh, yeah. I'm from Providence, Rhode Island. I know all about Lowell.
So I went to Lowell, Massachusetts. I showed up in the middle of winter with 2 suitcases, my rainbow flip-flops, and yoga pants. And the East Coast people were not so welcoming to the Californian. But yeah, I got my first job in brewing the week I landed there. I had emailed them and everything. And I was the first, to my knowledge, I was the first woman that they had hired in production on the production side of, it was a brew pub I worked for that no longer exists, called Beer Works. And on the production side, I think I was the first woman they had hired in 15 years of existence or something. On the production
really?
Side. Women worked as bartenders, wait staff, etc., but not in the production side. And it was definitely a culture shock for me in terms of working with all men. I worked with men who had backgrounds in being in the military, dock workers, construction, very traditionally masculine fields that I had no contact with before at that level. And I was also incredibly young. I was 21, 22 when I started working in that context. And it was overwhelming. I definitely dealt with a lot of sexism in that job. But I've continued to work in the brewing industry as I've done my other, all my degrees. So I've worked primarily with men for the past 10 years, which has been interesting, as a cisgendered woman from California. And I currently live in Belfast, Ireland. And I work in brewing now, but I work for my friends who are husband and wife, and it's just me and them working. So it's a very different dynamic than previous breweries I worked for.
Have you picked up a good Irish accent yet?
No, I am so bad. So my dad has an English accent. He's British, and I can't do accents. And I've tried to make fun of my dad when we're drinking and stuff. It's awful. It's terrible. I can't do it. But my dad does a really my dad and my brothers can do a really funny, make fun of Americans accent. I can't do it though.
I feel like making fun of Americans is kind of like shooting fish in a barrel at this point. It's not really fair.
Takes much skill.
Yeah, not at all, right? So that's awesome that you've now worked in brewing in multiple continents, and like you said, it's primarily a masculine occupied field, right?
And we kind of had our own Me Too movement. I mean, you guys are both in the entertainment industry, right? Like, so, you know, during the pandemic, social media has been a crazy force for change in a lot of different industries, and we had our own Me Too movement. And that was interesting. Like, a lot of guys that I thought were solid people that I worked with were not that nice, as I found out. You know, like, it was an interesting time to be a cultural anthropologist in the industry, and also to kind of analyze how the industry got to be the way it has been in terms of traditional masculinity, and, like, you know, even unpacking that word. I'm sure that's something we're going to do during this episode, but it got a lot of my friends, both male and female, who are in the industry and non-binary, discussing all of the norms that we have.
Sure, sure. Well, let's start right there, right? Like the concept of masculinity. You're working in what could be considered a typically masculine field. How do you see that manifest in, like, the men you work with, in the way you're treated in the field? Like, talk about that for a bit.
So one of the interesting things about masculinity, we're all going to put our anthropology hats on right now. So if anybody's like, if anybody's like, what's anthropology? It's just the study of humans and cultures. It doesn't have a great history in terms of colonialism and stuff, but most modern anthropologists are solid people. But if you put your anthropology hat on and just think about the idea of masculinity, we often associate that with just men. But we all participate in these gender norms. So there's a guy who did a great podcast. If anybody's interested, the American Psychological Association hosted him on their podcast, and he is an expert on masculinity. Ronald Levant, I believe is his name. I think he's at Harvard now, but he was in Ohio. He wrote a book called The Tough Standard, and he talks about masculine gender norms being synonymous with being male, but it's really a gender norm, or a social norm, or a social construct. And what we mean when we say social construct is just something we've made up as a society. So within the Western lens, and this is applicable in other cultures as well, but he kind of defines it as, I think there's 5 things that he defines it as: avoiding all things feminine, restricting expression of emotions with the exception of anger, self-reliance, toughness, and I think under that umbrella he has dominance, and like a strong focus on sexual connection without the emotional component of that. And then he discusses about the shift in this, but a disdain for sexual minority men. So men who are traditional masculinity would have a disdain for men who are gay or bi.
Oh, okay.
So those are the components of what we would call traditional / some people would refer to it as toxic masculinity. But one of the interesting things is, like, as an anthropologist, I've been trying to unpack, like, do we have a positive version of masculinity? And is it important to have a positive version of masculinity, or are those traits just simply being a good human? Like, do we need that dichotomy of femininity and masculinity? One of the things that always comes to mind, like, I've spent the last couple of days talking to some of my buddies. I actually was telling Brad, I spoke to my dad for like an hour and a half the other day, and that was super interesting. We haven't had like a explicit conversation about masculinity before, and I was really surprised with some of the things my dad said. But I found that my friends who are a bit younger, so I'll say like 40s and younger, a lot of them were like, what do you mean? Like, what's important to me about being a man? That was one of my questions to them. And I was like, well, I don't know. Like, do you feel like your masculinity is important to you? Is it important to identify with that? And a lot of them were like, no, not really. Like, I want to be a good dad, or I want to be a good husband or boyfriend, but like, it's just about being a good partner or person. And whereas, like, my dad did have an answer for like what he thought were masculine traits, and he named them as empathy and compassion, and caring. And for a little bit of background, my dad grew up, he's working class Englishman from Leicester, and his dad was a Royal Marine. So, like, a lot of people, like, I was really surprised that for him it was that cut and dry, but he did say there was a shift when he moved away from some of the peers that he had grown up with in England, and he had moved to California when he met my mom, like 32 years ago or whatever. So, masculinity, when we're talking about it, and sometimes people get frustrated or upset when they hear the phrase toxic masculinity because it's equating all things that are masculine as toxic. But I think you have to do a little bit more unpacking as to why we have that label, and it falls under the umbrella of patriarchy and dominance and things like that. But you certainly can be a man and not be a toxic person. I don't want people to hear the phrase toxic masculinity and just say like all men are toxic. That's not what feminists or sociologists or anthropologists are trying to say. They're saying we have these set social norms that aren't really helping or serving the men that sometimes are forced to ascribe to them.
And I think, you hit the nail on the head there with, like, people will hear the word toxic masculinity and shut down. They stop listening, right? Because a lot of these, what you're ostensibly doing is you're saying that some people who may identify as masculine, that's bad. But that's not how toxic masculinity works. Being masculine is not bad. There are elements of masculinity which are completely fine and great and awesome. It's when you take these elements that are usually associated with masculinity and they start getting twisted and corrupted and fucked that people have a problem. But again, the minute you say, toxic masculinity, anyone who associates with men will oftentimes have like a guttural emotional reaction, shut down, stop listening, and start attacking.
And do you think, from your perspective as a cultural anthropologist, do you think that people do that because they're insecure in their own masculinity?
So this is a really interesting thing that researcher I spoke to you guys about, Robert Levant, talks about. I told you about this study when we were talking the other night, Brad. And he talks about the precarious masculinity, or the threatened manhood. That's an actual thing he kind of studies. And one of the experiments that he's done repeatedly is having groups of men dividing them into two, and having one group of men do a feminizing task, such as braiding mannequin hair and putting pink ribbons in them, and the other group doing like knots, like Boy Scout knots or sailor knots or whatever. And then afterwards, they take both of those groups of men and they invite them, like, hey, do you want to just sit quietly in this room, or do you want to go punch the shit out of this like kickboxing bag? And there's a huge difference. The men who were in a feminizing task go to punch the punching bag. And it's because in front of other men, like, this is the what they've gathered from doing this over and over again, it's their masculinity was somehow questioned by doing this feminizing task. Now, obviously, braiding hair is not inherently feminine or assigned to women. I mean, if we look at indigenous cultures, many men grow their hair very long, and it's a sign of masculinity. And that's the other thing we have to unpack when we look at this term of masculinity. It's not the same across cultures, and it's not the same over time. Even if we look at Western culture, high heels used to be for men.
Yeah.
We can walk into any museum and look at old-timey portraits, and there's men in makeup. They're basically in what we would call drag now. They're just vibing, like.
Yeah, nice turned out calf and nice powdered wig. Yeah.
So a lot of what I push against, for me personally, and my perspective, because there's not going to be a universal consensus. I mean, I don't know what degree Jordan Peterson has, but he has a degree in something, and somebody is allowing him to teach, and he has very different views on masculinity compared to me. And so from my perspective, we have to consider things like class and race and time and space in terms of what are identified as masculine behaviors. I think when men in our society, let's say California, you can draw. I'm from Orange County. I grew up in Orange County. You guys are both in LA, right? So very close in proximity. So when we are driving around, I was just home for a funeral for the weekend a few weeks ago, and I saw more lifted trucks than I could possibly count, more Trump flags, and all of these assertions of like, don't tread on me. And that you can't really separate that type of masculinity from, you know, American identity. Like that is one really, really niche specific type of masculinity. You'll see the same thing in New Hampshire, right? Like studied in the wolves in New Hampshire all the time. So there's lots of different things that happen with identity, with cultural expressions of that. Like if you feel as though you're being threatened as a group, you might feel the need to perform masculinity in a greater sense than if you were just not feeling that threatened or whatever. And I know you guys don't get political, so I don't want to go too far down that route, but there's definitely
a political component to it
Sure.
that I think you can't escape. I mean, I find it very interesting that the kind of voices who dominate the field as to dictating what is masculine these days, Jordan Peterson's, Ben Shapiro's, are guys who don't uphold the masculine ideals they espouse. You know, Ben Shapiro, for instance, is like 4 feet tall and his voice sounds like some guy in an 80s movie who got kicked in the nuts. He doesn't look like he's ever done a push up in his life. And you know what? All that's fine. But then he's out there trying to say that we should all be, you know, Arnold Schwarzenegger from the 1987 movie. And it's like, well, you're not doing it, dude.
Yeah, what's going on there, bro? What's going on there?
I would say those men are victims of precarious masculinity in that they wish to ascribe to this very rigid set of values of masculinity. And you know, like that is their choice. And I'm not a man. I don't get to decide what masculinity is or isn't. But the other thing that comes up within Levant's research is he talks a lot about violence and violence against women, gun violence, all of those things come up. And he thinks there's a direct correlation between these traditional masculine norms and forced adherence to them and the subsequent, you know, aftermath of sexual violence, gun violence, etc. And I would have to say, from what I've read as an anthropologist and sociologist, like I would agree with that. I think there is a relationship. The other thing I push back against is this idea of biological essentialism of some of the traits that we associate as either masculine or feminine. And you guys spoke a little bit about how non-binary people kind of push back against that in their own journeys. And I agree, like the more and more folks feeling comfortable to come out as themselves and stuff like that create space for these conversations to happen. But also the science just doesn't back up biological essentialism. The idea that women are naturally more emotional, for instance, isn't backed by science. When we look, it's a byproduct of socialization. So when we look at how we treat little boys, for instance, there's been numerous studies done, but little boys are actually more emotive as neonates. And by the time they're 2, we've socialized them to be less emotionally expressive than their female counterparts. And this is assuming everybody's cisgendered because little babies can't.
Sure, of course.
But the way we respond to little boys, even as infants, as a byproduct of our own socialization, is shaping them. So they've done, one of the first things I learned about when I took my women's studies class in college was there's this study that they did on repeat for a while. I think it was done in the 70s and the 80s, but they would wrap babies in blue or pink blankets. They would take groups of parents and their newborn babies, and they would be like, okay, we're going to swap the babies around. Like, obviously, we're going to keep track of whose baby is who, but we're going to wrap babies in blue blankets and pink blankets, and your job is to just comfort them for the next couple of hours or whatever the case was. And without fail, there was hardly any exceptions to this. People were more responsive to babies wrapped in pink blankets, regardless of their actual gender or anything, or biological sex, I should say, perceived gender. And they were less responsive to the babies they thought were boys. And so this implicit thinking affects how we treat our children from the smallest age, because we do socialize boys and girls with different toys, and there's a lot of pushback in that, and with millennials and more progressive parents. Like one of my ex-boyfriends, I was talking to him about doing this podcast, and we were discussing like how his parents were purposely, like, he's in his 40s, and they purposely gave him Barbies because that's what he wanted at that time. And that would have been really unusual, but now that's becoming more and more commonplace.
Sure.
To allow children to kind of be gender neutral with their toy selections. But biological essentialism of certain emotions, like women are more empathetic or caring, all of that is socialized. And it varies across culture as well.
Well, I wanted to actually ask you about that cross-culturally, because you've mentioned you went to school in Lowell, Massachusetts. You grew up in California. You currently live in Belfast. Those are three very different cultures, even though I know that, yes, California and Massachusetts are both in America. As someone who's lived in both places, culturally very different.
Yes.
What have you experienced, let's say now that you're overseas? Are you seeing similar traits, habits,
As you guys know, I'm an adopted person too, so there's another layer. My first adoptive family was actually Mexican American, so that really shaped my understanding of some gender norms and things like that in the California context. But I actually think there's more cultural similarities that I've observed, and this is anecdotal, this is not like a study I've done or anything, between the East Coast of America in the New England region and Ireland/England.
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah.
Than there is between East Coast and West Coast.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. All day.
Prior to COVID, I remember getting off the plane in California after being in the Boston area and being like, everybody is so fucking happy here. What is their problem? And just like being like, what's wrong with me? Oh my God. Like, and
Yep.
when you're the driving culture, like, I don't know if you've noticed this, but like, Brad, where are you from? You're from like Tennessee or something.
I'm from
like that,
Tennessee
right?
originally. Yeah.
Okay, so you can probably speak to like a whole other area of America, but like, it is, to me, it's like almost like different countries in terms of driving culture. In California, I'm expected to like wave and thank people and stuff like that. I tried doing that when I was driving around Boston because I had to drive the beer truck and do deliveries.
Yeah.
People are seeing this as weakness and they're going to kill me. Like, oh my God.
Exactly.
See, in Tennessee, you don't do that because nobody drives more than 30 miles an hour anywhere. Every time I go back, I'm on the I was about to say the freeway, but it's
You
the,
don't
it's
have
the
freeways,
interstate.
yeah.
It's the interstate. And I'm just constantly like, get the fuck out of my way.
Yeah, I think it's funny because like I said, I came from the East Coast, and coming to California, and I've lived all across the country because I've done theater, and I was within like a year of leaving the East Coast and having lived in like Ohio and Colorado and Omaha and California. It was like a smack in the face to the different cultural ideas and norms that exist throughout the country, which I think is so funny because like we have this idea of American nationalism when I'm like, well, but America is so fucking different depending on where you are and when you are. It's so I don't know. Sorry, I didn't mean to detract completely from your statement, but
no, but like that point is very true. So like I live in Belfast, which is a small metropolitan area. Well, it's not small, it's a major metropolitan area for Ireland. And the experience here in this city context is very similar to Lowell, I would say, in terms of how people interact with each other. But then you go into more rural areas of Ireland, which is not that far out of the city, and it's probably more similar to like the Midwest of the US or something like that. California is an interesting one because we have such a variety of cultures in such a small space, that it kind of depends on, I feel like, almost what neighborhood you're in and also how you present. Like growing up in foster care, I experienced Southern California very differently than some of my peers who were in the group home with me who might have been Black or Latino. Like, they had a very different version of LA than I did.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of it too. And I think when we think about masculinity, if you were to talk to a Black man in the context of the US, depending on where in the US that man is, he might have a very different experience of masculinity or expectations of him as a Black man in that context versus his white counterparts. There's certainly Black sociologists who've written on that as well.
Yeah, it's interesting too, especially in relation to mental health. A friend of mine, poet Linda Addison, she's Black, and she talks a lot about how the topic is completely verboten amongst Black men. Like, as much as men in general have a hard time talking about mental health, Black men refuse, from her perspective, to talk about it. But apparently that's a common thing. On that note, why do you feel that men have such a difficult time talking about mental health in general? Do you feel like it comes back to those 5 points?
I think it comes back to those 5 points and this attitude that we all have. I think we are all brought up with these biological essentialist views of like, oh, men are just that way. And I'm a woman who dates men. Like, I'm not married. I'm currently single, dating. And I have had the fortune of mostly dating really kind, wonderful, like in touch with their emotions men.
Well, good for you.
For the most part. I've had a couple. Wow. There's been like 2 or 3 where I'm like, that was, I talked to my dad and he's like, why'd you do that? And I was like, I don't know. But all of those, like, sorry to any of my ex-boyfriends I'm friends with that might listen to this, but all of those men have opened up to me about their mental health at some point or another. So I won't be singling anybody out, but men are less likely to go connect with other men sometimes, especially at a younger age. And, when I look at the media that young boys are encouraged to consume, not a lot of that media is about relationship building. Like, you turn on an episode of, I don't know, like Transformers or Ninja Turtles or whatever's targeted towards boys and men, and there's an adventure, there's what we call parallel play. You guys talked about this on your episode of Masculinity. Well, you'll do something together, and I've noticed this with my male friendships. That was a weird adjustment for me. I'm like, how are you feeling today? I'm on my period. What did you do this weekend? Blah, blah, blah. And like, I remember the guys in the brewery were like, what? No, we're not doing this. We're gonna like sit and drink our coffee in silence and not look at each other. And like, literally, that's one of the aspects of parallel play that happens sometimes, is like men sit together and they don't look at each other. They'll just like do something together. They'll do a task together.
Yeah.
Or watch a game together or whatever. And what I would say is men are less encouraged to ask for help because of those traditional masculine norms, that stoicism and self-reliance that Western society tells men they need to adhere to be a man or feel empowered in that identity. And I think it's really crucial we push back against that, because ultimately men suffer. And it's not just men who are putting that on men, it's also women too. I don't know if you guys have seen any of the crazy shit about trad wives.
No, what's a trad wife?
Oh, a little bit.
You know about this?
Yeah.
I'm so out of it. Go, tell me, go.
Okay, so there's this new trend I've seen on Instagram. I spend a lot of time on social media, and there's this new trend of trad wives who are like, it's not just women who are like, oh, I want to be a homemaker. I love spending time at home. These are my skill sets. It's women who are like, this is your job as a woman. Like, they want to go back to the 1950s.
Oh my, okay.
Yeah. And they espouse these ideas of men should be providers and stuff. And not even that extreme, but if we look at modern dating coaches and stuff, I get a lot of that shit on my For Me page on Instagram. And I hate it. And a lot of these people, like these women who are coaching other women, are saying, you need to find a man who's going to have a provider mindset. I can't tell you how many times I've seen that. And like, the anthropologist in me is just cringing, because I'm like, when we only equate men to their vocational ability, it's such a dehumanizing process. Like, even if you're like gung-ho, I love capitalism, which is not my attitude, but even if you are, there's a problem with that, because the precarity is we're all going to lose our job at some point, or you're going to be unable to work, or you're going to get injured, or like, you as a man cannot be stoic and self-reliant. You actually need other people. Like, that's how evolution has worked.
Do you think the trad wife thing is maybe a response to kind of the economic hardships we find ourselves in? The idea that, you know, you can have a couple, both couples work, yet you're still struggling and having a hard time to get by. But if you find that guy who can be a provider, and you can just hang out and be a housewife.
I think it's more about embodying some bullshit white supremacy, to be honest, because a lot of the aesthetic that's being pushed in the trad wife sphere is like, I'm like, how is anybody affording this? You guys have like a 40-acre farm, and like, and I'm like, oh, they have intergenerational wealth because somebody's granddad owned a plantation. Like, you start unpacking some of these things that we see on social media that no one could actually do if they're a regular person. You see there's a lot of BS behind that, like, in terms of like, no one is self-made.
Well, you talk about you talk about how, like, a man is more than just his job, right? Like, you cannot just confine someone to that, because at that point, let's talk about the farm thing. You're talking about a plow horse, right? Like, a man is only as good as long as he can pull that plow, and the second he can't pull that plow anymore, what good is he? And if that's how you feel valued, or if that's how you view yourself as your intrinsic value, you're going to do everything you can to keep pulling that plow, regardless of the injuries you might sustain, regardless of, you know, any sort of trauma that you might be going through. You're just going to put your head down, and that's just going to fester wounds, you know, build up problems, and until eventually the plow horse explodes, which I think is how plow horses work. I've never been on a farm.
I mean, that's how my plow horses
Well,
are.
yeah, I mean, you're from Tennessee. Yeah. I assumed you knew about plow horses.
Exploding plow horses. Yeah, it's a very puritanical kind of mindset. The idea that work is a virtue in and of itself. Mm-hmm. That just, if you work and you're a hard worker, that instantly bestows on you some kind of morality. When, in reality, that damages your identity, that damages your ability to interact with other people, especially if you're working a job that doesn't require interpersonal interaction.
Oh, God forbid.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, I saw this in brewing. I talked about this in an article I wrote, where this is something that is hopefully changing in the brewing industry. But that first job I worked, there was this attitude of like, you know, we don't pay attention to OSHA rules. You lift 2 kegs at a time and put them in the cold box. And, you know, it's such an arbitrary thing. Like, it'll take me 10 more seconds to just lift 1 at a time. Right. But there's this performance that I find that men do almost in front of other men. But I bought into it as well. Like, I participated in that. And I was like, oh, well, I'm not good at my job if I don't also do this thing that's being asked of me. Yeah. And there's some professions where, like, you need to have a certain level of physical strength in order to do your job. Like, if you're a firefighter, you need to be able to, like, carry a person out of a building. But there are also, you know, women who could do that. So it's not just a gendered thing.
Enjoying Batshit? Please like, subscribe, and share it on social media. If you have someone you think may need to hear it, we encourage you to share it with them and to start your own conversation about mental health.
There's a lot of women who do powerlifting.
Yeah,
there are.
Yeah,
there are. Like, I don't have this vision of powerlifting as like this toxic masculine sport at all. Just because, like, I see women on Instagram and stuff, and like that's their thing.
As a sport, it's definitely not. Like, I go to a powerlifting gym. It's run by the world bench press champion. And it's a very supportive environment. Like, there's a healthy competitive element, but people aren't Like they don't look down at anyone for not being as strong as them. It's all about like, are you improving your numbers? Hey, you're stronger than you were last week, and everybody gathers around and applauds you. I was just saying, as far as the performative aspect, I find myself when I get out of that being like, oh, I'm gonna assert my alpha dominance around here by being the strongest dude.
But isn't that interesting though? Because you were just talking about how like your gym is run by the bench press champion of the world, like people who are professionals at this thing, which is attributed to like a male, a masculine attribute, strength, right? So when you take it in like a professional setting and you have people who really understand what it is, how it works, how to manipulate it, how to improve it, it doesn't have to be about being a man or a woman or however you identify. It's more about the task itself. And, as opposed to a layman who is just, being strong, right? Like I feel like culturally, it's almost like an ignorance element, right? Like once you know enough about something like, for instance, powerlifting, you understand men can do it, women can do it, whatever. But if you don't know shit about lifting anything, you just assume that the guy who's bigger is going to be able to do it better, and therefore that's his job.
What's super interesting about that point is one of my friends, she is a power lifter and she's beautiful. She's like also could be a model and stuff. She's an Instagram influencer. And she is very traditionally feminine looking, cisgendered femininity. And she is probably about my build. And we were talking about this because I brew beer, so I have to lift a lot at work. And I am stronger than probably the average person on the street. Not necessarily powerlifting strong, but like I can lift heavy stuff.
Sure.
And she obviously can lift even more than I can. And we were talking about this, about how constantly men underestimate her strength in normal gyms, but they never do that in powerlifting gyms. Because these men understand like, oh, training, we're looking at the skill of this, the athleticism of this. They don't have a gendered norm. And I always found that so interesting when, random, or there's been a few times for me, for instance, where I'll be moving something heavy in a brewery and we'll have in Boston there and Lowell, there used to be groups of guests coming in to do tours and stuff. And more than once I'd be moving something and a guy would come in and try to pick up the thing I was lifting. And I would just let him like drop it on the floor because he couldn't lift it, but he assumed.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
What I find out interesting about what Melissa told me about powerlifting was that men in powerlifting gyms never assume that she can't do it because they're trained, athletes.
Whereas in normal gym culture, it's so like bro driven.
Oh, it's ridiculous.
Here, I'll tell you a funny performative story for me. Recent guest we had on, Jessica Wall. She's also an artist, and she had these big like rolls of flooring she was going to put down over her hardwood floor to catch paint. And she was like, "Can you come over and help me carry these? They're pretty heavy." And I was like, "Yeah." And it's definitely something two people need to carry. Like it's incredibly long and stupidly heavy. It was like 100 degrees out. And I like stood one up on its end, and I was like, she was like, "Well, let me grab the other." It's like, no, I can get it. I like bear hugged it and like struggled it up onto my shoulder, and I was like, it felt like my knees were gonna explode. Got inside, I'm just like pouring sweat. And,
but you've already committed, so you got to keep
I got to. But like 3 feet into it, I was like, two people really need to be doing this. And then I put it down, and she was like, "You want to take a break?" I was like, no, let's get the other one.
And what is it about that? Like, I find myself doing that where I'm like, no, I got it. Like, and I'll struggle for like 30 minutes before I ask for help. And I'm like, oh, I'm picking up some like toxic masculine stuff for being annoying.
Yeah, that's totally. I mean, these are kind of funny examples of it, but I mean, that's what it comes back to: is men refuse to get any help for anything.
Oh, because needing help is weakness, right? You can't be weak.
It's the self-reliance thing that you said is one of the 5.
I had an ex-boyfriend glue his eye shut with a hot glue gun at work. And I had to drive him to the doctor. He was like, no. And I've got a story from almost every ex-boyfriend where I'm like, you need to go to the doctor. And I have to like drag them to the doctor. And the doctor's like, it's a good thing you came to the doctor. And I'm like, What the heck?
Wait a minute. What job were you doing that he was using a hot glue gun and touching his eye?
So no, in breweries, we do a lot of the packaging and stuff in house.
Okay.
And so we were gluing boxes shut. You know those mix packs of beer that you get at your local off license or whatever. Or sorry, I'm using Belfast vernacular in your local liquor store.
Or a packy if you're back east.
Yeah, that term always didn't
Packy?
sit right with me.
It's a package store, packy.
Yeah. So the glue guns we use to seal those mix packs are the industrial strength. They're not like your local Michaels or Joanne Crafts glue guns. They're industrial strength glue guns. And one of them dropped to the floor and it just shot up and glued his eye shut. And he was in so much pain. And I was like, dude, I've got to take you to the doctor. We've got to go. I'm going to drive you. And he was like, no, it's fine. I'll get in the car. We're going to the doctor. But I don't mind telling that story because that was one of the not nice boyfriends I had. But all of the guys I've dated, there's always been some time where I'm like, you should go get help for that or get that looked at. And sometimes it's mental health stuff. And it's no, I got it. And I'm like, do you got it though? Do you got it, bro? I don't know if you do.
I love that story because when you were my boyfriend glued his eye shut with a hot glue gun, I immediately went to the Joanne Fabrics, Michaels, you guys were making something out of pipe cleaners at work, I guess, on break. And I was just this sounds amazing.
It's the theater kid in you. You're just
It's true.
There's crafting, right?
There must have been crafting something.
Had to be crafting going.
Putting sequins on something. I don't know. That's how it works.
But yeah, and I've seen that at work repeatedly where we'll get injured or burned or something like that, and we'll all just decide oh, we're gonna keep working throughout the day. Where a normal person would probably be oh, maybe we should go to the doctor and get that checked out.
Yeah. I think part of that is and maybe this ties into the stoicism of it, is the ability to endure pain.
Sure.
And suffering is considered a masculine trait.
There's a quote I wrote down for our podcast, you guys.
Ooh, I love when people do research. Go ahead.
So one of my favorite books on masculinity is actually written by a Black woman named Bell Hooks. And she talks about, I think the title of the book is Men, Masculinity, and the Will to Change or something like that. But the quote that I took from it, I think encapsulates what I am concerned about in terms of men in Western culture and their mental health. And she says, the first act of violence that patriarchy demands of males is not violence towards women. Instead, patriarchy demands of all males that they engage in acts of psychic self-mutilation. They kill off the emotional parts of themselves. If an individual is not successful in emotionally crippling himself, he can count on patriarchal men to enact rituals of power that will assault his self-esteem. So this idea of that's the first victim of patriarchy is actually men. And it's so heartbreaking. When I think of, I have nephews, I've worked with kids before, and these precious little boys, they're being told that they have to dehumanize themselves by cutting off access to these emotions like pain, sadness, or anything that's not anger, really.
And by society. That's one of the things as a parent that gets me, is a lot of that's beyond your control, because
right.
We've been very cognizant of how we raise our children in those regards. And yesterday or 2 days ago, my kids are playing some video game online with a friend of theirs. They've got their friend on the phone. And my 7-year-old, the friend got upset about something. My 7-year-old goes, "Don't be a pussy."
Ooh.
And I was like, whoa. Hold on. Where the fuck did you hear that language? I say fuck a lot. If he said fuck, I'd understand it. But
Don't be a fuck.
First off, where did you hear that? Second, let's have a talk about what that means.
Yeah.
Because that's definitely not a concept we've introduced at home.
It's peers. No matter how progressive you are as a parent. And I hear it in I have a friend who's focusing on gaming culture for her PhD.
Oh God, I feel terrible for her.
Well, she's really into video games and knows a lot about it and stuff. But I've been reading stuff on the side just so I can stay abreast of what she's doing. And it's the language that young, predominantly boys, are being exposed to in these spaces. Like, they'll talk about, like, trigger warning for anybody, but like they'll talk about like, I'm gonna rape you or whatever in the game, like, and it's just, the parents may not even be teaching that, but there's the social peer pressure to conform to this really violent rhetoric. Even if, like, you can ask a 10-year-old, what does that mean to rape someone? Do you know what that means? And they'll be like, huh, no. Like, they just equate it with dominance, and that's what it is, unfortunately. Like, but it's unpacking all of that, and like you just said, your kid didn't get it from you, but someone has said that around.
Yeah, and we've locked down all their video games. They can't, play games with random people online who might say shit like that. So they're picking that up at school.
It's horrible to think about how much people that you don't want to be influencing your children get to influence your children.
Yeah.
Like, that's heartbreaking.
I am terrified, and God, I hope this never happens, but just thinking of those terms, like the things that they'll hear at school and repeat, I am terrified of the day one of them says the N-word, and I have to be like, all right.
Oh, God.
Sit the fuck down.
Oh, God damn it.
Well, and like, one of the things that is getting better, I think, with our generation of parenting and stuff, I'm going to lump myself in with you guys because I have friends with kids and we talk about this stuff. One of the interesting things is, like, parents now are getting more comfortable having proactive conversations, not just about like language around masculinity and stuff, but about relationship building in ways that, I talk to my male peers and I'll be like, do your parents ever have like a sex talk or relationship talk with you? And across cultures, very often it's no. Like, there was no explicit conversation. It was just like, use a condom.
Right.
And,
Everything I knew about sex, I learned on the school bus.
or pornography. Like,
pornography.
a lot of, and girls too, learn their first understandings of sexuality are coming from pornography without the context. Like, I'm a very sex positive person and I support sex workers, but we have a very complicated industry with pornography, right? There's ethical spaces where people are getting paid and valued and etc., and then there's unethical ways in which it's being produced, right? And there's also, these kids are getting no context for, this is a performance and you don't have the frontal lobe development to understand what's happening here, or that this is
and
a
some of the
specific
niches,
genre.
Yeah, some of the subgenres, like the abuse porn, or I find disturbing the very popular subgenre of stepdad and stepdaughter.
Oh yeah, or ancestral stuff. I don't. Yeah.
It's so pervasive, and we all like to think we're not influenced by passive consumption of that stuff, but we are. And when young children are getting that at really vulnerable ages through teenagehood and stuff, it's going to shape your understanding of sexual expressions and stuff like that in really unhelpful ways. And fortunately, I think there's been, especially in places like, where we're from, California, parents are getting more comfortable being like, hey, you might come across some stuff on the internet as you get older, and this is, even like spaces like Twitter where you might just be scrolling. Like, I don't consume any explicit content on Twitter, but some stuff pops up and I'm like, I'm on a public bus. Like, what? Why is this? Like, she's got a great butt, but why is this on the, like, there's somebody's grandma next to me on this bus?
Well, and that kind of ties back into what you were saying too about masculinity being defined with sexual conquest minus the emotional components.
Yes, and I think there's been a lot of feminist analysis of this. There are certainly sociologists and feminists who are like, no, there's no ethical production of porn. As a historian, I disagree. There's always been images of erotic content throughout the ages. But I would say that, yeah, the messaging that a lot of young boys and young girls get about women is conquest. Like, the goal is to get as many notches on your belt as you can. And women effectively, even if you're not committing sexual assaults, the disposability of women is something that I think young boys are taught from quite a young age. And I've had, and this impacts women as well, I've had numerous conversations with women, you know, at my age and older, like in their 30s and 40s, where like for the first 10 years of my marriage, I didn't think I could have an orgasm because I just, you know, I thought sex was for the man. And that part of that is purity culture. I mean, like if you grew up Catholic or Mormon or whatever, like you were told that sex is for the men in your life, and men were also told that. And so it's that does a disservice to everybody. I mean,
Well, yeah, and I mean that can go back to what you were speaking to earlier too, about like you were talking about how like a what do they call the trad wives, something wives, trad wives, about talking about how like this is a man's value, right? A man's value as being a provider. You know, how many women over the years must have been told that like your value is as a, I don't know, a sexual partner, a you know, a caretaker. You know what I mean? It's that same idea of like twisting the relationship, or twisting what should be a relationship into a commerce type of interaction.
It's a transactional relationship.
Transactional. That was the word I was looking at.
That's what patriarchy values, and that's what we'll refer to as toxic masculinity values about male-female relationships. And you find men who are like, I have a lot of male friends just because of my job and over the years, but there's definitely men that I've spoken to who don't have platonic relationships with women. And, you know, like there's this attitude that I think is hopefully changing, but I've watched so many, you know how they talk about like gay parents being groomers and stuff? This is like a big discussion in
they're grooming their children. Yep. Okay.
So I can't tell you how many times I've heard like straight boomer parents be like, oh, he's gonna break all the girls' hearts someday, or they're overly sexualizing like a young girl in a crop top who's like 6, and I'm like, she's 6, she's an infant. Like and that messaging, or like they shame little boys for being friends with girls. I remember that happening when I was a kid. There was a kid in our class who was way more comfortable like hanging out with us and like being on the swings instead of playing basketball or whatever, and he just happened to like be friends with most of the girls in the class. And I remember he was bullied mercilessly by the boys for being gay, and I don't even think we knew what gay was in an explicit sense. Right. But he was bullied by other boys for being too feminine. And this is something you watch adult men do to other men. Like you just said, stop being a pussy came from a child, but I've heard grown men say that to other men about the most inane shit. Like, oh, I'm gonna use an oven mitt to pick up this thing on the grill. Like, and then some other guy would call him gay, and you're like, what does that have to do with anything?
It's like, oh, you don't want to get a 3rd-degree burn?
Oh man, when I was in my early 20s, in my group of friends, anytime one of us like complained about something, another one would go, "Oh, is your vagina hurting today?" Yeah.
I rubbed some. I did a NJB, which is like basketball, when I was a kid, and I played football, and like I remember I had a coach. I can't remember which coach it was, but I was the only girl on the team or something that day. And he said to one of the boys that to rub some Vagisil on it or something. And we were kids. And I remember being like, what's that? Like, and so this messaging, men do it to each other as full-grown adults. And then boys watch that happen and think, oh, that's what I need to emulate. And even now, that researcher I mentioned earlier, he said, he talks to a lot of dads, and even the most progressive dads, their attitude is, my job as a father is to make a man out of my son. And, you know, unpacking, what does that mean?
What's that even mean, though?
What does that mean?
Yeah.
Being a man. I mean, that's so...
It's such a minefield for a parent. I talk about that a lot. Is you know trying to bestow what I see as positive masculine traits on my kids without them getting all the other shit. But then, like you said, they're going to pick that up anyway because
Right. And you
society's
also
going to force
have
it on
to
them.
allow them to protect themselves because they're going out into a world that is patriarchal and
Yeah,
does
and as much as you want to be progressive and create these ideals, are you setting your kid up to be bullied because of them?
right.
You
And
know,
you know what, like I don't know what the answer to that is other than like constant communication, or like I know some parents who have little boys who maybe like wearing dresses or something like that. They have the home as a safe space where they can do that if they're not comfortable doing it outside. Like the most important thing is like just don't be your kid's first bully. Like,
yeah,
Yeah,
you
good
know,
luck with that.
yeah. My 7-year-old has gotten into Barbies, but he also punches hard enough that he beats up his 11-year-old brother and like literally takes shit from no one. This kid's been to the emergency room like 3 or 4 times. So I'm like, you know what, man? Like, that's fine. Like, play with what you want. Because any kid at school says something, like,
the
you're
next
okay.
Steve Knievel.
Yeah, yeah. Like I could see some other kid like trying to make fun of him for playing with Barbies and him just headbutt him.
You know what's interesting when we're talking about like men's mental health? You guys, I don't know if you talked about this, but I was interested in your perspective because something my dad mentioned to me when I asked him about growing up is he said, you know, I never saw my dad cry except for one time the IRA bombed some barracks near Deal Beach and he saw his dad cry. And that's the only time he saw his dad cry. And um, like I've watched my dad cry watching Frozen. That's his favorite movie.
Aw, that's nice.
Um, but you know, like in a lot of ways, my dad does embody traditional masculinity and not in a toxic way, but like he sees his role as to be protective. And, you know, like he got mad once because a guy showed up to our house and I was like 22 or something. Like, you don't want some guy you're on a first date with to meet your parents yet. And this guy like honked the horn out front and texted me instead of like coming to the door. And my dad was like, no, you're not going.
I mean, anyone who honks to pick someone up, I don't care if it's on a date or otherwise, deserves a kick in the head. I don't. This is rude.
But like, you know, so my dad does have that idea of like being protective and stuff. And I have three brothers and a sister, and he spoke about like I never saw my dad cry. He described all these really good things about being masculine. But then he said to me, he's like, I did have a different set of fears when your sister was born. So I was adopted when I was 15. So my younger sister was actually like the first girl in terms of the baby stuff. And he felt more concerned because he knew how bad men were to women and stuff. And they're a different set of worries, I guess. But like, did you guys have, I know, Brad, you talked about in one of the podcasts, like your dad wasn't around very much.
No, I was raised by my grandparents, but my grandfather, I never saw him cry. Um, no, they were kind of gutted by my mother dying, and that depression was on them till the day they died, and he dealt with it with anger.
Yeah.
You know,
So the only emotion you really saw from him would that have just been being angry and
yeah, yeah. It's kind of what you said again. Those 5 points. Like I grew up learning that was the only emotion that men were allowed to experience was anger. That's the only masculine emotion. And even now, it's I'm not comfortable crying in front of other men. The interesting thing is though that when I have cried in front of other men, I get more sympathy and empathy from them. I've had female friends that I've cried in front of, and they represent like their take on it is very toxic masculinity.
mm-hmm.
Like they get very uncomfortable in the idea of like you shouldn't be doing this. You're supposed to be strong and stoic.
I think as a whole we're uncomfortable with men's emotions other than anger.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed.
And that's kind of sad also because like you were talking about it can represent as violence so much and violence toward women. And yet the way that the patriarchy forces women to deal with masculinity, they're still more comfortable with men's anger.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I have I've definitely witnessed, not in my personal circle, but men being abused by women that they're in relationships with, and they don't have access to feeling, I mean, they do have access, but they don't want to identify as being abused by a female partner or something like that. And so I think women, if they're bad or abusive people, can also weaponize that and harm men further. That's definitely a thing that happens.
Yeah. I mean, we have so much language just implicit around the idea of masculinity and destroying masculinity. The word, as you were describing that popped in my head, is emasculated. There's not an equivalent of that for femininity in the English language.
I think women, when we are told we're not good women and stuff, we're accused of being too masculine. That certainly has happened to me. Or you're labeled, one of the insults that hopefully is dying out is you get labeled as a lesbian. And I'm like, that's not really insulting to be accused of being a lesbian.
Yeah.
But it's, anything that's not feminine in a traditional sense or whatever is, if you would deviate from your assigned gender by whoever's doing the abusing, whether it's sociostructurally or interpersonally, like, you're usually just accused of being the opposite gender, I find, in some way, shape, or form.
Agreed.
Gay men deal with that constantly. Bi men, like, oh man, the number of men, they what's his name? The guy I keep talking about who did all that research, Ronald Levant. He had a bunch of men write their secrets on a thing. He shuffled them up and then he started reading them. And he said it was heartbreaking. He said, I asked these men to write their deepest secrets that they never told anybody. And he said some of the most common ones were, oh, I had a crush on another boy. And that just broke my heart. 50, 40-year-old men, feeling shame that far along in life over just a normal human emotion, the way we treat bi men as not valid is really unfortunate.
Yeah. We have such a tendency to put everything into a box instead of looking at it as a spectrum.
Right. Everything has to be very black and white. There's no grays.
Yeah.
Right. And even some of the discussions you guys have had about bipolar disorder has been really illuminating for me. I have had a few friends who've had pretty serious mental health issues and stuff over the years. And I grew up in foster care, so I was exposed to a lot of different things kind of early on. And there's a spectrum of symptoms that people can experience with things like bipolar and depression. And giving people access to be somewhere on a spectrum rather than, oh, you're only always going to be experiencing this or only experiencing this, I think is really important.
Yeah, we were talking about that recently on an episode. We had a therapist, Rebecca Stevens, on, and the idea that the DSM-5 has a very narrow classification of symptoms that qualify you for being bipolar, but the actual list of symptoms that you can experience is huge and varied.
I was going to ask you guys about that too. How do you think, because honestly, your podcast is really refreshing to have two men who are supporting each other. I think that's more and more common for men to talk about this stuff with each other, but to do so publicly is really healing and awesome, even for me as a woman. But how do you think, for yourselves, your journeys with mental health and masculinity have intersected? Did it take you longer to get help, you think, because of being a man, or how's it?
Oh, definitely.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely. I think not only internally, it was a long time until I accepted that I needed to get help, and basically my life had to implode for that to happen. But so after I started the podcast, for instance, my high school girlfriend wrote me and was basically like, yeah, I always thought you had something. And I was like, why did you never say anything? And then I started talking to friends. My friend Charlie, I had talked to, and he was like, oh, yeah, we always knew, I always figured you were, bipolar or something. And I was like, why the fuck did nobody say this to me?
Right.
Because people don't talk to men about their mental health. they either dismissed it as something else, or even if they thought that I did have an issue, no one ever brought it up to me. And I think you get rid of all these things. I think I could have been diagnosed 20 years earlier.
I think for me, it was also a matter of like acknowledging that it's a problem, like that it's an actual illness, that it's not just something that's just life. This is how you're supposed to feel. This is how you're supposed to react. And, these are the emotions that are supposed to be surging through your system. Like, this is just something you're going to have to deal with. So deal with it. Like, don't ask for help with dealing with it, because everyone else must be going through the exact same thing. So if you were to be the one who stepped forward and said, hey, I need help, again, going back to our discussions of admitting weakness, right? It's like it would.
Well, and the idea that, we accept a lot of bad behavior from men in society, first off.
That's the other thing I was going to say.
Yeah. Well, so my father, my biological father, I think he was also bipolar. But the way everybody brushed it off, like everybody in his family after he went to prison, would talk about it. Bobby was just wild. He was just wild,
Or he just had anger issues is something I hear a lot about older men.
Yeah. And you just kind of brush it off whereas a woman exhibiting those same traits, you'll be quicker, I think, to say she has an issue and probably needs help.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's the duality of that too, where sometimes we pathologize women for having very normal reactions to very bad man behavior.
Yeah.
And because I think psychotherapy, my history brain could be wrong in this, but I think it was kind of pushed forward by Freud in order to address the hysteria of women. Crank out 4 babies, have 0 orgasms in 20 years. Of course she's crazy.
Yeah.
Fucking mental. I don't know. Just come on.
That's do you guys know that's where the vibrator came from?
What, really?
Yeah. It was a psychological treatment for women in the 20s, 1920s or something like that. You used to have to plug them into the wall.
That's fun.
That's interesting. You just brought up accepting a lot of poor behavior from men and just excusing it as oh, he's just a man. He doesn't handle this kind of thing well. There's a guy named Greg Matos, I think. He's actually a military psychologist and a family psychologist, but he wrote this article that came out in 2022 and it was all over the internet, and it was the rise of single lonely men. And he was talking about how I think he mentioned the increase of gray divorces, so women leaving their husbands and stuff. But he was also talking about dating apps and how men in the US this was specific to the US, really struggling because women ages 20 to 45 have higher expectations now of emotional communication and shared values and stuff. And this goes back to masculinity almost being for other men sometimes, because a lot of men talked about oh, well, I need to look this way, or I need to have this kind of job in order to do well on these dating apps. And the research was showing that women had these characteristics of emotional availability, good communication, and shared values as being the most important things. So the whole article just did the rounds, and he was saying, this needs to change if these men want to be partnered, because there's just less tolerance for this kind of behavior that would have existed in the past.
Sure.
Yeah. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Ayden, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for joining us and talking with us today about toxic masculinity and your experiences with it. And it's been a lot of fun and really informative. We hope you're gonna come back and talk to us about more stuff. Because I know you and Brad have talked about it offline, but growing up in the foster care system, living now in Europe, experiencing the Belfast masculinity versus the American masculinity. There's so many more things that we would love to speak with you about.
Yeah, for sure. We can open the adoption foster care minefield.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm sure it's gonna be a breeze, right? It's not gonna be a 17-part episode or anything like that. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Everyone who's listening, thank you so much. Ayden, if you could do me a favor, actually, after we get off this, and email me like some of the studies that you may have mentioned, or some of the researchers. I'd love to share some of them in the bio of the episode that we're going to post.
Yeah, absolutely. Most of the things I listed are from a specific podcast, so I'll just link
Great.
that over to you.
Okay.
You want us to promote another podcast? All right.
It's the American Psychological Association. I'm sure there's some overlap with.
You know what? This has all been a long con. She's got another podcast. This is just her promoting her own podcast. I knew it. No, definitely. Yeah, please send me that podcast information. We can put her up there. Everyone who's listening, if you're a man, don't be toxic. If you're a woman, don't allow a man to be toxic.
And if you or somebody in your life, you even remotely consider needing help, get it.
Yeah, get it. Talk to somebody. There's
Go to the doctor.
Yeah, just go to the doctor. Just go to the doctor and tell him how you're feeling. There's nothing wrong with that. That does not make you a weak person.
That feels bad saying that in an American context and even in a UK context, because access to mental health services is shit. So, if you can go to the doctor, if you have access.
Well, talk to your partner. Talk to your friends. Talk to your family. Just talk to someone. Please do not think that you have to suffer in silence. That's not how it works.
That's not healthy.
It's not healthy.
And remember, to end on a down note, men are 4 times more likely to commit suicide than women.
Whee! Thank you for listening. Keep fighting. Know that you're seen and that you're loved. Take care of yourselves.